I would like to start with testicles. Men who sleep 5 hours a night have significantly smaller testicles than those who sleep 7 hours or more. In addition, men who routinely sleep just 4 to 5 hours a night will have a level of testosterone which is that of someone 10 years their senior. So a lack of sleep will age a man by a decade in terms of that critical aspect of wellness and virility. And we see equivalent impairments in female reproductive health caused by a lack of sleep.
So how does caffeine work and how does it impact our sleep and disrupt our sleep? Well, caffeine is a class of drugs that we call the psychoactive stimulants. And I should note, by the way, it's one of the only stimulants that we readily give to our children without too much concern or thought. But caffeine will impact your sleep in a number of different ways. Firstly, because it's a stimulant, it's more likely that you will have difficulty either falling asleep, or if you fall asleep, you may have difficulty staying asleep, that it will wake you up, and then it's harder to get back to sleep. That's the first problem with caffeine. The second one is something that many people don't understand about caffeine, which is that its duration of action is much longer than you may expect. Caffeine has what we call a half-life of 6 hours, but it has a quarter life of 12 hours. In other words, if you have a cup of coffee at noon, then a quarter of that caffeine is still in your brain at midnight. So a cup of coffee at midday is the equivalent of tucking yourself into bed, and just before you turn the light out, you swig a quarter of a cup of caffeine or a cup of coffee, and you hope for a good night of sleep. And that rarely happens. The third thing about caffeine is that it will actually block your deep sleep. So some people will say to me, I'm one of those who isn't really affected by caffeine. I can have a cup of coffee after dinner and I fall asleep and I stay asleep. So isn't that okay? Well, one standard cup of coffee in the evening, and we've done these sort of studies anywhere between 150 to 200 milligrams of caffeine in the evening, will actually reduce the amount of deep sleep that you get that night by about 20%. Now, to put that in context, I would actually have to age you by about 15 or 20 years to decrease that amount of deep sleep by 20%. Or you can do it every night with a cup of coffee. So caffeine is one of those things that you can restrict. Certainly caffeine in the morning can be used strategically, but try to limit caffeine probably after about 10 o'clock in the morning, or at least try to cut down your caffeine intake 14 hours before bedtime. Decaffeinated coffee, it turns out, doesn't taste so bad.
We've all heard of this thing called beauty sleep, you know, it's sort of this old tale that you would get. Well, it's actually true. And there was a wonderful study done in Sweden, and they took a group of healthy young individuals and they gave them a full night of sleep, and then they deprived them a night of sleep. So they went through the experiment twice. And at the end of each one of those, after a good night of sleep or being sleep deprived, they took a portrait shot. And then came the second part of the experiment, which was essentially a beauty contest, where they took independent judges who knew nothing about the two experimental conditions, and they just said, rate these pictures on the basis of how attractive, how healthy people look, how sickly they look, how tired or sleepy they look. Right. And even though these judges knew nothing about the experimental conditions, they routinely rated you when you were shot under conditions of being sleep deprived as being less attractive, looking more sickly, and looking a lot more tired.
That's after one night?
After one night. So there is objectively a thing called beauty sleep, wow. And people independently. Because what we've discovered over the past 10 or 15 years is that you need sleep after learning to essentially hit the save button on those new memories so that you don't forget. So sleep will actually future-proof that information within your brain. But recently we've discovered that you not only need sleep after learning, you also need sleep before learning. And now to actually prepare your brain almost like a dry sponge ready to initially soak up new information. And without sleep, the memory circuits of the brain essentially become waterlogged, as it were, and you can't absorb new memories.
Let me show you the data here. So here in this study, we decided to test the hypothesis that pulling the all-nighter was a good idea. So we took a group of healthy adults and we assigned them to one of two experimental groups, a sleep group and a sleep deprivation group. Now the sleep group, they're going to get a full 8 hours of shut-eye, but the deprivation group, we're going to keep them awake in the laboratory under full supervision. There's no naps, there's no caffeine, by the way. It's miserable for everyone involved. And then the next day, we're going to place those participants inside an MRI scanner. And we're going to have them try and learn a whole list of new facts as we're taking snapshots of brain activity. And then we're going to test them to see how effective that learning has been. And that's what you're looking at here on the vertical axis, the efficiency of learning. So the higher up you are, the more that you learn. And when you put those two groups head to head, what you find is a quite significant 40% deficit in the ability of the brain to make new memories without sleep. I think this should be frightening considering what we know is happening to sleep in our education populations right now. And we've gone on to discover what actually goes wrong within the brain to produce these types of learning disabilities. And there's a structure that sits on the left and the right side of your brain called the hippocampus. And you could think of the hippocampus like the informational inbox of your brain, in that it's very good at receiving new memory files and then holding on to them. And when we looked at this structure in those people who'd had a full night of sleep, we saw lots of healthy learning-related activity. Yet in those people who were sleep deprived, we actually couldn't find any significant signal whatsoever. So it was almost as though sleep deprivation had shut down the memory inbox, and any new incoming files, they were just being bounced. You couldn't effectively commit new experiences to memory.
The other thing I would note, by the way, that's increasingly now interesting within the brain is not an acute effect, but a chronic effect. That chronic effect concerns Alzheimer's disease. And we now know that insufficient sleep is probably one of the most significant lifestyle factors determining whether you will develop Alzheimer's. Why is that? The reason is because at night there is a cleansing system that kicks into high gear within your brain. So in your body you have a cleaning system called the lymphatic system. Well, in your brain, we recently discovered that you have something called the glymphatic system. And at night, it's during deep sleep when that cleansing system kicks into high gear and it washes away all of the toxic metabolic byproducts that build up during the day. Because wakefulness is low-level brain damage. One of the sticky toxic proteins that it washes away at night is a protein called beta amyloid. And if you deprive rats of sleep, they immediately start to escalate the amount of this Alzheimer's protein in their brain after just one night.
If you've pulled an all-nighter or you've had a short night of sleep, maybe you went to bed too late and you need to wake up early again, can you get back that lost sleep? Unfortunately, this is one of those myths. Sleep is not like the bank in the sense that you can't accumulate a debt and then hope to pay it off at a later point in time. And let me give you the evidence to make that point very clear. If I were to take an individual and deprive them of a whole night of sleep, 8 hours of lost sleep, and then I give them all of the recovery sleep that they want on a second night or a third night, yes, we see that they sleep longer. They try to sleep it off, as it were. But do they get back all of that 8 hours that they've lost? And the answer is no. Even if we keep measuring them, they never get back that sleep that they lost. So you cannot accumulate a debt and then hope to pay it off at a later point in time. And many of us do this in society. We're short sleeping during the week and then we binge with our sleep at the weekend. It's what we call social jet lag, or what I sometimes describe as sleep bulimia. It's this. Now, there was a recent study, a very interesting study, where they looked at the mortality risk of short sleep. And firstly, what they found is a quite shocking result. Those people who are sleeping 5 hours a night have a 65% higher likelihood of dying at any time. A increase of 65% in terms of mortality risk. However, if you get another group of people who are short sleeping, maybe just 5 or 6 hours a night during the week, but then sleep a little longer at the weekend, you can actually reduce some of that mortality risk. But there's a danger here, but it's associated with a far less healthy life. You're far more likely to suffer from diabetes, to be obese, to have poor cardiovascular health and have cardiovascular outcomes. And if you look at that study, even though some people were trying to sleep back at the weekend some of that which they'd lost during the week, they were almost twice as likely to report being in very poor health relative to people who do what we generally recommend, which is consistently get good 7 to 9 hours of sleep every day, both during the week and the weekend. So the recommendation right now is to get consistent sleep, whether it's the weekend or the weekday. Keep doing that consistently. Unfortunately, sleep is not like a credit system, not that you would wish for, unfortunately. The leading cause of death in late-stage adolescent teens in most developed nations is not suicide. That's actually second. It's this: road traffic accidents. And here, sleep matters enormously. So another example comes from Teton County in Wyoming. They shifted their school start times from 7:35 to 8:55. And the only thing that was more remarkable than the extra 1 hour of sleep that those kids reported getting was this. There was, as a consequence that following year, there was a 70% reduction in vehicle accidents that following year. Just to put this in context for you as they're bringing this down, the advent of ABS technology in cars, anti-lock brake systems, that prevent your wheels from locking up under hard braking so you can still maneuver, that dropped accident rates by about 20 to 25%, and it was deemed a revolution. Well, here is a simple biological factor: getting enough sleep that will drop accident rates by up to 70%. I think we need to radically reconsider the importance of sleep in education. Should you use a snooze button? Well, certainly what I've said before is that regularity is critical, going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time. And certainly using alarms can help you do that. But what about the snooze button though? Unfortunately, it's probably not a good idea, because there is some data that I discuss in the book where if you look at the cardiovascular response to an alarm, it's actually quite a stressful event for your cardiovascular system. We see a spike in heart rate, stress chemicals increase. Now, it's fine to use an alarm just that one time in the morning to wake you up, but you shouldn't really be hitting the snooze button, because then you are repeatedly assaulting your cardiovascular system. And you may think, well, I only hit it maybe sort of 3 or 4 times, how bad is that? Well, maybe for that one day it's not bad, but if you're doing that every single day, every week, every month, every year, every decade, across a lifetime, you can imagine the type of additional cardiovascular strain that places on people. So use the alarm, that's fine, but try to use it once and then get up and have a good day.